We must continue to decolonize our existing structures. And the racism, sexism, and economic inequality that has allowed such violence against Indigenous women and girls to prevail must be eradicated. The National Inquiry formally presented their final report, in which they found that the tragic violence that Indigenous women and girls have experienced amounts to genocide. We accept their findings, including that what happened amounts to genocide.
The Prime Minister carefully choosing his words after the final report into the inquiry for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was delivered earlier this week, saying he accepted the findings of the report, including the word genocide, but he didn't go so far as to say the government agreed with that conclusion. So why is that? At Issue is here to dig into the politics around the report. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Tanya Talaga is also in Toronto tonight and joins us for the first time. Nice to see everybody. Let's start with the Prime Minister's response. I wonder what difference would it have made to the notion that this is genocide as the inquiry puts forth if the Prime Minister had owned that word himself. What difference would that have made politically, do you think, Chantal?
I'm not sure, but I think the fear on the part of the government, and not only the government, the word genocide did not resonate in question period, even from the NDP benches, as far as I could tell, was that there was pushback as soon as the word was out, and a lot of the pushback came from people who are otherwise not the usual suspects in questioning every move that the government makes on the front of Indigenous reconciliation. So I think the Justice Minister summed it up best, David Lametti, when he said that the government did not want this to become a debate over whether it's genocide or not, in a way that takes away from everything else that is in the report.
And the Prime Minister said that too, that his focus now, he wants to shift to doing the things in the report. But Andrew, what was your reaction when you heard that very careful language, also always in the past tense? I noticed, that we recognize that it was genocide as opposed to it is, which I think is what the inquiry was pushing.
Yeah, and the inquiry was careful to define it in a term in a way that is different from, I think, the commonly understood definition of the term. It's by its nature an extremely inflammatory term. It may have a lot of justice behind it, but you can understand why anybody in elected politics would be careful around that word. They'd be careful because it has some legal and international implications. They'd be careful because they're trying, I think, to build consensus around action on this. And the broadest possible consensus is not necessarily going to be found around that word. I think you will find consensus around people saying we have to act. We are implicated as a society in the state of Indigenous women and the terrible things that have happened to them. So I think everybody on all sides is trying to find a way where we can actually get forward and make action on this. It may have had the service of kind of rubbing our noses as a society in what has happened, but I think at this point we want to get beyond debates about words and into actual actions.
What do you think, Tanya? Do you think that the debate around the word is useful, or that, as the Prime Minister has suggested, we need to move on to something else?
It took a long time for the Prime Minister to say the word. It took about, oh my goodness, it took 8 hours and it took 24 hours for him to say it with a little bit more conviction. But you know what? We need to get Canadians to say the word too. This is something that we have to teach Canadians, because we can't say this as if it's something that happened in the past. It's actually still going on right now. We're still seeing so many of our women dying. We're still seeing so many of our children taken away by children's aid societies. We're still seeing all of the same problems like lack of housing, lack of clean water. All of these things amount to what we've seen in this country, which has been a genocide.
Are you or any of you worried about the fact that we are 5 months from an election and that 231 calls to action have been, calls to justice have been made? Some things have already been started with this government, but some are brand new. Some are new ideas. And is there concern that this is one of those reports, in spite, again, what the Prime Minister said, this isn't going to collect dust, we're going to move forward? The reality is there's an election and we may end up with a different government, and I wonder what happens to this report in the next 6 months even, Chantal.
I believe every party in the House of Commons wants to do better on this file. I am not convinced that with the same degree of political will. As we speak in the Senate, Conservative senators are using every trick in the book to prevent a vote on a bill that would align or say that we should align our laws with the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous people. So that doesn't kind of scream political will on the side of the Conservatives. No, regardless of the outcome of the election, I have never seen a commission of any kind come up with any number of recommendations, and those recommendations being treated as they were tables brought down from the mountain. I expect any government to pick and choose. Sure. Not all the recommendations are addressed to the federal government. But bottom line, yes, I do believe that the parties in the House of Commons, there is not a I don't want to do anything party among the parties on the ballot.
Andrew, do you think that there is enough political will writ large to do at least some of what is there, if not all?
Yes, and I agree with Chantal that as with any commission of inquiry, any set of recommendations, they deserve careful scrutiny. And not all of them are going to be well considered, not all of them are going to be affordable, not all of them are going to be beneficial. There's lots of sensible stuff in there, but it wasn't handed down to us by God. So I hope that there will be a proper procedure. I hope we don't do either rushing into doing all of these things just because we want to show that we care, and I hope we don't just let it sit on the shelf either. So you want the middle path there.
Tanya.
Well, I think that Marion Biller and the commissioners have done an incredible job, and I think that there are things we could do right now before the election comes, because we don't know what's going to happen with the election. And so right now there are things we could do right away. You know, why not get an ombudsperson right now? Why not start a task force on the women that we have lost, a new police task force looking at that? Why not take a harder look at the justice system? You know, but there are incremental things we can do right now, and there's no excuse for not doing those as we work on a greater plan. I still think this country is still digesting the TRC Commission's calls to action. There are so many in there. Many of what we're seeing with the calls to justice with this report, they mirror those. You know, this also mirrors what we've seen at the CHRT with Cindy Blackstock, you know, the calls for equity in our society. The time is now, and we need a national plan to work on that. And so I think that we could get started on that plan. You know, let's build the basics now, and then let the election come.
It was, not that I've read all of it, because it's a very big report, but the parts that I've read, they are difficult to read, you know, for Canadians. It is difficult to sort of digest that. And I wonder if that makes it a more politically sensitive issue, if that makes it harder to talk about. Maybe it doesn't matter that it's hard to talk about, but I wonder if it makes it politically more difficult.
I don't believe that for 1 second, that reality in a report should make it more difficult to implement. There are two different things. One of the reports that was hardest to read and that was mostly implemented dealt with the situation of women in Kingston, in jails in Kingston. Yeah. That wasn't pleasant to read. That is the point of having commissions. They're not there to make you feel good. And they shouldn't exist if they're not dealing with an issue.
Yeah.
So I don't think that makes it difficult. But to the point that we're getting close to an election, I don't believe that at this juncture, with 3 months to go, A, the government has the capacity to come up with a coherent national plan, but B, that it should and manage to avoid having it become a political football in the election, which is not necessarily a desirable outcome.
Yeah, it did. I mean, it did sound like when I interviewed Minister Bennett earlier this week that the task force that they want to put together with families, with all the players, with different people, that this too will be a conversation now. How do we implement these kinds of things? So it's not going to happen overnight. Tanya.
No, it's not, but let's get started on the work now. You know, we've been waiting for over 150 years in this country to achieve some resemblance of equity. So why are we going to wait even longer? I think that we need to move forward. And as with, you know, when we're talking about genocide, this is not something that's come out of the blue. This is something that Indigenous people have been talking about for quite a long time, you know, and the TRC also brought this up 4 years ago, actually almost to the day of the release of the National Inquiry's report. They called it cultural genocide, but the commissioners chose this time around just to say genocide. They called it like it is. And, you know, it's an uncomfortable truth, and we all have to we have to deal with this in order to move forward as a nation.
Could it be part of an election conversation, Andrew? Not whether it should be, but could it be? Because maybe it's not something that everyone wants to sit around debating during an election because it is difficult.
And because it's rife with capacity for misunderstanding, for high expectations that get disappointed, for people to be attributing bad faith to each other. These are explosive types of topics. They can be debated, but Kim Campbell famously said an election's not time to talk about serious issues. I don't genuinely subscribe to that, but this kind of issue I think we want to be really, really careful around, especially in the fevered atmosphere of an election campaign.
Okay, well, this was a good place to have a good conversation about it, so we're beginning there. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, for extra content. This week, we're going to talk about the Justice Committee's vote to remove one Conservative MP's controversial remarks entirely from the record. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.